The private jet sat on the bright runway, its polished body shining under the golden light of the setting sun. The sky was painted in shades of orange, pink, and purple, making everything look like a scene from a magical movie. The lights along the runway glowed brightly, guiding the passengers as they walked toward the plane. Men and women dressed in expensive clothes moved across the red carpet leading to the aircraft entrance. Their shoes clicked softly against the ground, their perfumes filled the air, and their smiles were full of confidence. These were rich, powerful people who were used to luxury. They laughed softly, whispered about business deals, and talked about the fancy things they had recently bought. But among them, one man stood out. Or rather, he didn't stand out at all. He wore a simple coat, slightly worn at the edges, and carried an old backpack slung over one shoulder. His dark hair was slightly messy, and he had a bit of an unshaven beard. His face was calm, his shoulders relaxed, and he didn't walk like the others. There was no rush, no need to impress anyone. He climbed the metal stairs leading into the jet quietly, without drawing any attention. Inside the jet, the cabin was beautiful. Keanu Reeves walked slowly down the wide aisle, taking in the details. The seats were made of soft beige leather, large and comfortable. Small golden chandeliers hung from the ceiling, giving the space a warm, gentle glow. To the side, there was even a small bar with bottles of expensive drinks neatly arranged. The passengers were already seated, chatting about business and money. Some laughed at private jokes, others discussed investments and their latest expensive cars or watches. One of the flight attendants, Catherine Holt, moved through the cabin with perfect grace. She was used to working on private jets like this, and over the years she had developed a sharp instinct. She could tell who was rich, who was powerful, and who was pretending. Her sharp eyes scanned the passengers, quickly judging them based on their appearance, posture, and attitude. When her gaze landed on the man with the worn-out coat and old backpack, she frowned. Something about him didn't fit. He didn't look like someone who belonged here. She leaned toward another flight attendant and whispered, "Are you sure they checked the list of passengers?" Her coworker raised an eyebrow and replied, "Of course. He's on the list." Catherine glanced at the man again. Maybe he was an assistant to one of the important passengers. Maybe he carried bags or handled business for someone wealthy. But when their eyes met for a moment, the man simply gave a small smile. He said nothing, just looked at her calmly before turning back to the window. The engines of the plane hummed softly as the doors closed. The jet started moving, picking up speed as it prepared to take off. Catherine continued her work, making sure the passengers were comfortable. She handed glasses of champagne to two businessmen in the front, then moved on to another group of investors who were laughing about a deal they had made. When she walked past the man in the worn-out coat, she acted as if he didn't exist. She didn't even look at him. She didn't offer him a drink or ask if he was comfortable. The man didn't react. He didn't seem upset. He just tilted his head slightly as if he found the whole situation amusing. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing higher and higher until the city below was just tiny lights in the distance. Catherine stole another glance at the man. She still didn't understand why he was on this flight. But what she didn't know was that this quiet, ordinary-looking passenger was about to change her life forever. The flight continued smoothly. The passengers settled in, enjoying the luxury around them. Soft music played in the background, the clinking of crystal glasses and quiet laughter filling the air. Catherine moved through the cabin, pouring champagne into glasses, making sure everyone was happy. When she reached the row where the man was sitting, she looked right past him again. She didn't even ask if he wanted a drink. The man noticed, of course, but he didn't say anything. He simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. A few minutes later, when Catherine passed by again, the man raised his hand slightly and said in a polite voice, "Excuse me, could I have a glass of water?" Catherine stopped and looked at him. There was impatience in her eyes mixed with something else, disapproval. Then, in a cold voice, she said, "Only important passengers get full service." A quiet tension filled the air. Some nearby passengers had overheard the conversation and glanced toward them, sensing the awkwardness. The businessman sitting a few seats away shifted uncomfortably. The man in the worn-out coat, however, didn't seem upset at all. He just smiled slightly and said, "I see." Then he turned back to the window as if nothing had happened. The businessman sitting near him furrowed his brows. There was something familiar about this man. He couldn't place it, but he felt like he had seen him before. Meanwhile, Catherine continued serving the other passengers, her smile warm and kind, only for those she thought deserved it. The flight continued without trouble, but inside the cabin, something felt off. Catherine kept looking at the man. She didn't like the way he sat there, so calm and unbothered as if he belonged. She wanted him to know that he didn't. A few minutes later, she decided to make that clear. She stopped next to his seat and said, "Sir, this area is for important passengers only. There are open seats in the back." The man lifted his eyes to her. His face was still calm, but his gaze was sharp. "I'm fine here, thank you," he said. His voice was polite but firm. Catherine hesitated. She was used to people following her instructions without question. For a second, she thought about forcing him to move, but then she simply walked away, muttering under her breath. The businessman nearby watched everything closely, his interest growing. A few minutes later, Catherine was pushing the drink cart down the aisle again. She looked calm, but inside she was annoyed. As she passed by the man's seat, he shifted slightly, his shoulder barely touching the cart. It was almost nothing. But Catherine saw an opportunity. With a quick movement, she tipped a glass of ice water, making it spill all over the man's coat and shirt. A gasp spread through the cabin. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Catherine said in a fake apologetic voice, though a small, satisfied smirk played at the corner of her lips. Everyone was watching. The man looked down at his wet clothes, took a deep breath, then slowly lifted his gaze to Catherine. He said nothing. He just stared at her. But the way he looked at her made her uncomfortable. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something else, something that sent a shiver down her spine. Feeling nervous, Catherine crossed her arms and said loudly, "You don't belong here." The passengers stopped talking. They turned to watch. The businessman's frown deepened. Catherine continued, her voice sharp, "People like you think they can fit into a world that isn't theirs. But you always get caught." She tilted her head, her expression full of disdain. "Are you even American?" Silence filled the cabin. The man didn't move. He didn't blink. And for the first time, Catherine felt something strange, regret. The way he looked at her wasn't angry. I wasn't ashamed. It was like he already knew exactly what was about to happen next. And that made her nervous. The slap echoed loudly in the quiet airplane cabin, and it seemed to hang in the air like the loud crack of thunder. Everyone in the plane froze. Some people gasped, some held their breath, and others simply stared in disbelief. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Keanu Reeves, who had been sitting quietly, remained in his seat. His face had turned slightly from the force of the slap, but he didn't show any sign of anger. He didn't even touch his cheek where the slap had hit. He just sat still, calm as ever. Slowly, he turned his head back toward Catherine, who stood in front of him. Catherine, however, was no longer calm. Her breathing had become quick and shallow, and her hands were trembling slightly. The shock of what had just happened was beginning to sink in. She had slapped him, Keanu Reeves, the famous actor, and now she felt nervous and uncertain. A heavy silence filled the air, making everyone feel uneasy. It felt as if the world around them had stopped. It was as if time itself had paused, giving everyone a chance to think about what had just occurred. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of a loud beep from the front of the plane. The passengers turned their attention toward the cockpit. The pilot appeared from behind the door, his face sharp and serious. He looked around quickly, taking in the situation in an instant. His eyes fell on Keanu and the redness on his cheek from the slap. His expression grew dark as he understood what had just happened. "What in the world is going on here?" the pilot asked, his voice strong and filled with authority. Catherine swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she tried to stay in control. She wanted to look confident, like nothing had happened, but her nerves were starting to show. She crossed her arms tightly, trying to keep her composure. "A passenger who doesn't know his place," she said, her voice cold and sharp. She tried to sound like she was in charge of the situation, but it didn't work. The pilot's eyes narrowed, his expression becoming even more serious. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" he asked, his voice full of disbelief. Catherine felt a little surprised by his reaction, but she tried to stay confident. "Honestly, I don't care," she said, her voice carrying a hint of arrogance. "If he's causing trouble, he should be removed from the flight." The entire cabin felt tense. Everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one was sure what was going to come next. Then the pilot did something no one expected. He let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. He looked at Keanu and then, in an unexpected move, he removed his captain's hat. Catherine's eyes widened in confusion. Why would the pilot take off his hat? The pilot gave a small nod of respect toward Keanu. It was a gesture that caught everyone off guard. Catherine frowned, completely confused. She glanced around, seeing that some passengers were also puzzled by what was happening. They didn't understand what was going on. Then the pilot finally spoke the truth. "This is Keanu Reeves," the pilot said. "He owns this airline." The entire cabin erupted in surprise. There was a sudden murmur of voices as passengers began to whisper and exchange looks of disbelief. Phones were pulled out and people started recording the scene. Catherine's face turned pale. She couldn't believe it. She had just slapped the owner of the airline and she had no idea. Her legs felt weak, like they were about to give way beneath her. Her stomach dropped, and she felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. The businessman who had been quietly watching everything from the beginning now crossed his arms and smiled. Well, this just got interesting, he said, clearly enjoying the situation. Keanu, however, remained completely calm. He didn't seem angry or upset. He didn't even react to the shocked murmurs around him. He simply nodded slightly toward the pilot, acknowledging the truth. Then he spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Thank you for stepping in," Keanu said. "But I think it's already clear to everyone what happened here." Catherine felt the weight of the moment. She had been trying to make Keanu look bad, but now she was the one who looked terrible. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and she felt the heat of embarrassment rising in her face. Her hands were clammy and her mind was racing. What could she say to fix this? The murmur of voices around her grew louder. Passengers were talking to each other, whispering and pulling out their phones to record. The whole world was about to see what had happened. Catherine knew her moment of humiliation was going to spread far and wide, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The businessman who had been observing the situation with interest now gave a small smirk, clearly entertained by the drama unfolding before him. Keanu, still seated and composed, didn't let the attention bother him. He just sat there, calm and in control as the world around him reacted. The pilot cleared his throat, bringing Catherine's attention back to him. He turned to her with a stern look and asked, "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Catherine opened her mouth, but she couldn't find the right words. What could she say? There was no excuse for what she had done. No explanation could make the situation better. She could feel all eyes on her, waiting for a response, but she had nothing. I didn't know," she said, her voice weak and barely above a whisper. The pilot raised an eyebrow and looked at her in disbelief. "And if you had known who he was, would you have treated him differently? Or would you have just pretended to be nicer?" The question hung in the air, and Catherine felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but she knew deep down that no words could change what had happened. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Catherine could feel her face turning red from the embarrassment. The passengers around her were still talking and recording, and every detail of her humiliation was being captured. The worst part wasn't just the embarrassment. It was the realization that everyone could see her for who she really was. She had tried to make Keanu feel small, but now she was the one being judged. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone who might feel sorry for her, someone who would defend her, but she found nothing. All she saw was judgment and disapproval. No one was on her side. But there was one person who made her feel even worse, Keanu. He hadn't said anything since the truth had come out. He didn't yell at her. He didn't insult her. He didn't try to get revenge. He didn't even look angry. He simply watched her. And that was worse than anything she could have imagined. Keanu took out his phone from his pocket. He unlocked the screen slowly with no rush. Catherine's eyes widened. What was he doing now? He began typing something on his phone, and Catherine felt a wave of panic rise inside her. She swallowed hard. What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaky and filled with fear. Keanu didn't answer. He just kept typing, his face calm and unreadable. The tension in the air was thick, and Catherine's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what was going to happen next, but she knew it wouldn't be good. As the sounds of the passengers talking and recording filled the cabin, Catherine's thoughts raced. She had just slapped the owner of the airline, and now the whole world was going to see it. There was no way to hide from the truth. And as she watched Keanu calmly type on his phone, she realized something. It was too late for apologies. It was too late to fix the mistake she had made. Keanu didn't say anything. He just put his phone back on the armrest and looked out the window like nothing was happening. But for Catherine, everything was still important. Then the pilot spoke again and his voice sounded serious. "We will be making an unscheduled landing," he said. Catherine felt the plane drop. Her stomach flipped. "What? No. Wait please," she begged. But no one seemed to care anymore. The other passengers went back to their seats, and people kept recording videos on their phones. Keanu Reeves, who owned the airline, just stared out the window as if nothing was wrong. Catherine's stomach twisted when she saw him. What is he doing? She thought, but before she could ask, the pilot spoke again. "We will be making an unscheduled landing." The sound of footsteps filled the cabin, and Catherine knew it was happening. She was being taken off the plane. She looked around, hoping someone would help her, but no one was going to. The passengers were all quiet, and even the pilot wouldn't look at her. Keanu still stared out the window like he wasn't bothered by anything. 2 agents came and grabbed her arms, leading her to the exit. "Please don't do this. I can explain," Catherine begged. Her voice was shaky and she felt scared, but no one was listening. When they passed by Keanu, she turned to him one last time, her voice trembling. "Mr. Reeves, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were," she said. For the first time, Keanu looked away from the window and looked at her. Everyone in the cabin was silent, waiting. Then, in a calm but strong voice, he said, "You didn't need to know who I am. You just needed to know how to treat people." His words hit Catherine hard. She wanted to say something back, but there was nothing left to say. Keanu turned back to the window, and to him, it seemed like the whole situation was already over. The agents kept leading Catherine off the plane. She felt lost, like her whole life had changed. What would she do now? Her job was gone, and people were talking about her all over the internet. She looked back at the plane one last time, hoping somehow she could change what had just happened, but the door was already closing. Keanu was still sitting there, calm as always, like nothing was wrong. The plane landed at its final stop, and the passengers walked off. They were still thinking about what had happened during the flight. But for Catherine, everything was different now. Her story was everywhere. People had recorded her being embarrassed and kicked off the plane, and it was spreading quickly online. Keanu, though, didn't seem worried. He walked through the airport just like any other traveler, with a backpack on his shoulder and no big security team following him. He didn't have anyone around him. But people were watching. A group of reporters saw him and rushed to ask him about the incident on the plane. "Mr. Reeves, can you comment on what happened during the flight?" one reporter asked, holding a microphone in front of him. Keanu stopped for a second, thinking about the question. Camera flashes went off, but his face stayed calm. "People often confuse luxury with money," Keanu said. "But real luxury is in how we treat each other." His words made the reporters look at each other. Keanu kept talking. "Money can buy you a seat in first class, but respect is something you have to earn." He smiled politely at them, said thank you, and walked away into the crowd. The interview went viral, and soon people everywhere were sharing Keanu's words about respect and kindness. A hashtag luxury is respect, started trending on social media. Meanwhile, Catherine's life had taken a big turn. She lost her job and her face was all over the news. People were talking about her mistake. It seemed like there was no way for her to start over. But Keanu's message became something important. He showed that real greatness isn't about money or power. It's about how we treat others. While everyone kept talking about what happened, Keanu was already ready for his next flight, living his life without needing to prove anything to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.